Have you ever been judged before you even spoke a word? Imagine stepping onto a plane, ticket in hand, seat assigned, only to be told this section isn't for you. Not because of your paperwork, not because of your money, but because of how you look. This is the story of Malcolm Gray, a CEO flying from Chicago to San Francisco. A man who had paid thousands for his first-class ticket, only to face humiliation at the hands of those who doubted he belonged. In front of silent passengers and whispering strangers, he was accused of fraud, threatened with removal, treated as if his very presence in first class was a crime. But what they didn't know was that Malcolm was no ordinary passenger. In his briefcase lay a contract worth millions and a clause that would flip the entire situation upside down. What happens when prejudice collides with quiet power? What happens when dignity, stripped away in public, is reclaimed with undeniable truth? Stay with us. Because this is not just about one man's seat. It's about all of us, and the world we're choosing to create. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss powerful stories like this one. The cabin smelled faintly of leather and recycled air, a mix that every frequent flyer knew well. Flight attendants bustled in the aisles, checking overhead bins, adjusting pillows, preparing for the morning flight from Chicago O'Hare to San Francisco. Among the stream of passengers moving through the jet bridge, a tall man in his early 40s walked with calm steps. He wore a plain gray hoodie, dark jeans, and sneakers that had seen better days. To most people, he looked like an ordinary traveler, maybe someone catching a quick business flight, maybe a dad going to visit family. Nothing about him screamed wealth or status. But this man was Malcolm Gray, CEO of Novatech Systems, a company that had recently signed a contract worth tens of millions with the very airline he was about to board. He wasn't here to flaunt his title, though. He was here to fly, to sit quietly in his assigned first-class seat, and to prepare for the presentation waiting for him in San Francisco. Malcolm handed his boarding pass to the flight attendant at the door. She scanned it without much thought, then pointed him toward the cabin. He stepped inside, briefcase in one hand, calm as always. But calmness had never been a shield strong enough to protect him from judgment. As Malcolm turned toward seat 2A, a sharp voice cut through the chatter of boarding. "Sir, this section isn't for you." The words came like a slap. The voice belonged to a woman in her 30s. Blonde hair pulled back into a tight bun. Uniform perfectly pressed. Her name tag read Samantha Price. Malcolm paused, confused. He raised his boarding pass slightly. "I believe this is my seat." Samantha crossed her arms and stepped into the aisle, blocking him. Her posture screamed authority, chin raised, eyes narrowed, body angled as if she were guarding a vault. "First-class seating is reserved for paying customers," she said, her tone laced with condescension. "I'll need to see your ticket again." Passengers already seated turned their heads. Leather seats squeaked as bodies shifted. The quiet hum of the cabin was broken by murmurs, whispers that traveled like sparks in dry grass. Malcolm held out his boarding pass. Samantha snatched it from his hand as though it were contaminated. She looked at it, then back at him. "Where did you get this?" Her voice grew louder, sharp enough to cut. "These seats cost more than you probably make in a month." Her words weren't just for Malcolm. They were for the audience she was building in the cabin. A few passengers frowned. Some pulled out their phones, ready to capture the unfolding drama. Malcolm kept his voice calm. "That's my boarding pass. You'll see it matches my ID." But Samantha wasn't finished. She lifted the pass in the air as if displaying evidence in a trial. I'll also need to see identification and the credit card used to purchase this ticket. We have protocols for situations like this. The way she said protocols made it sound less like a policy and more like a punishment. In seat 3C, an older white woman clutched her purse tighter. In 1A, a businessman checked his Rolex, impatient with the delay. Somewhere in row 2, a young man named Tyrell Johnson opened Instagram and tapped "Go Live." His caption read, "Y'all witnessing this discrimination on United." Malcolm inhaled slowly. His instinct told him to react, to defend himself, to push back against the insult. But another part of him, stronger, steadier, reminded him that anger would only feed the spectacle. "My ID is in my wallet," he said evenly. "Would you like to see it now?" Samantha rolled her eyes, dramatic enough for nearby passengers to notice. "Obviously," she muttered. "And once I have it, I'll need to verify that this wasn't purchased with a stolen credit card. We've had fraud issues lately." The implication hung heavy in the air. Fraud. Theft. As if the only logical explanation for a black man in a hoodie occupying a first-class seat was criminal behavior. Tyrell's live stream picked up the tension. Comments rolled in. "This is disgusting. What airline is this? Somebody better step in." Malcolm pulled out his sleek black wallet. Inside was his driver's license, several credit cards, and a platinum Amex. He handed over his license. Samantha stared at it like it was fake, her lips pressed in a thin line. "Malcolm Gray." She read aloud, as if testing the name on her tongue. Her skepticism clung to every syllable. Then she shook her head. "This could be forged. We'll need additional verification." Malcolm checked his watch. Departure was in 13 minutes. He knew how these moments worked. Once suspicion was planted, it grew like wildfire. It didn't matter what proof he offered. The assumption had already been made. "I'd like to keep my assigned seat," he said quietly, though his words carried strength. Samantha wasn't listening. She turned toward a male colleague, Daniel Morris, who had been organizing luggage. "Can you help me verify this passenger's credentials? Something doesn't add up." Daniel hesitated. He glanced at Malcolm, then at Samantha. His silence spoke volumes. He knew something felt wrong, but he chose compliance over courage. Malcolm felt the weight of the cabin pressing down. Dozens of eyes, dozens of silent judgments. He could sense the unspoken thought in their stares. "He doesn't belong here. Inside." His chest tightened. Memories surfaced: college professors who doubted his capabilities, investors who assumed he was the assistant instead of the CEO, hotel clerks who questioned his reservation. A lifetime of being mistaken for less. But Malcolm wasn't less. He was more than what any of them saw. And he knew, deep down, that he had the power to shift this moment. For now, though, he stayed calm. Calm was his armor. Calm was the sharpest weapon he carried. The hum of the engines outside blended with the rising murmur inside the cabin. A scene was unfolding, and everyone knew it. People leaned slightly in their seats, not enough to appear nosy, but enough to catch every word that was about to come next. Samantha Price still held Malcolm Gray's boarding pass in her hand, waving it as if she were conducting a performance for the passengers around her. Her voice sharpened like glass. "These first-class seats cost over $3,400 each. Can you explain how exactly you afforded this?" The question was not just a request for clarification. It was an accusation wrapped in a smile that wasn't a smile at all. Malcolm stood there in the aisle, 6'2", shoulders straight, hoodie hanging loose on his frame, and yet every eye measured him as if he were smaller than the space he occupied. He inhaled slowly. "I paid for it," he answered simply, his voice quiet, but steady. Samantha laughed, short and clipped, a sound that was less amusement and more contempt. She turned to the rows around her, inviting them into the theater she was creating. "Did you hear that he says he paid for it?" A ripple of whispers followed. A middle-aged man in 1C shook his head slightly, muttering something under his breath. In 3C, the older woman who had clutched her purse earlier now pressed it tightly against her chest, her knuckles whitening. Every reaction seemed to reinforce the verdict Samantha had already pronounced. At that moment, Tyrell Johnson, the 23-year-old in 4B, angled his phone more discreetly toward the aisle. His Instagram live counter ticked upward from 12 viewers to 21, then 34. The caption he had typed earlier glowed beneath the video feed. "Y'all seeing this discrimination on United dude? Got a first-class ticket, and they don't believe him." The comments started rolling in. "This is wild. Name the airline so we can drag them. He looks calm. Why they pressing him?" Tyrell licked his lips nervously, whispering into the mic. "This is really happening. Guys, like right in front of me. Man's just trying to take his seat, and they treating him like a criminal." Back in the aisle, Malcolm's patience was wearing thin, though he kept it buried beneath his calm tone. Inside, a quiet storm gathered. He had worked his entire life to get here. Years of late nights, missed holidays, sacrifices that no one in this cabin could measure. And yet, in this moment, none of it mattered. All they saw was a black man in a hoodie daring to sit where they did not believe he belonged. "May I have my boarding pass back?" "Please," he asked Samantha, his voice carrying a hint of steel now. Instead of returning it, she turned to her colleague Daniel Morris, who had been lingering nearby. "Daniel, can you check this? Something doesn't feel right. His ID doesn't match the situation." Daniel shifted uncomfortably. Glancing between Samantha and Malcolm, he was the type who avoided confrontation whenever possible, the kind of person who followed the current rather than swim against it. With a hesitant nod, he stepped closer, though he didn't reach for the boarding pass. Malcolm noticed his hesitation, the flicker of doubt in his eyes. For a second, Malcolm almost wanted him to speak up, to say what everyone else could see, that the pass was valid, that nothing about this situation required such hostility. But Daniel stayed silent, trapped between loyalty to his colleague and the quiet voice of conscience in his head. Samantha pressed on. "Until this is resolved. Sir, I'll need you to step aside. We cannot allow potential fraud to delay boarding." The word fraud echoed like a gunshot. Passengers in the nearby rows shifted uncomfortably, their eyes flicking between Malcolm and the flight crew. Some reached for their phones. Others leaned back, eager to stay uninvolved, yet unable to look away. Malcolm's jaw tightened. Inside, his thoughts spiraled. If I argue, I'm the angry black man. If I stay silent, I'm guilty by default. What choice do they leave me? He pictured his daughter, only 8 years old, sitting in a school classroom where she would one day face the same unspoken judgments. He thought of his wife, who had told him that morning, "Stay calm, no matter what. People will test you." And he thought of his employees at Novatech, hundreds of them counting on his leadership, on his ability to stay composed even when the world tried to tear him down. His breath steadied. Calm, always calm. That was his armor. Still, there was only so much armor could do when the arrows kept flying. From the corner of his eye, Malcolm noticed Tyrell raising his phone a little higher. He caught the young man's whisper, faint but clear. "I got you, man. The world's watching." Those words gave him a spark of reassurance, Someone was paying attention. Someone cared enough to document what was happening, to make sure the story didn't vanish into silence. Passengers nearby reacted in subtle ways. A businessman in 1A sighed loudly, clearly irritated that the flight was being delayed. A younger woman in 2C frowned at Samantha's tone, but kept her mouth shut. A college student in 5D snapped a quick photo, then turned away as if she hadn't. It was a study in human behavior, how quickly a crowd could become complicit through silence. Samantha, sensing the silence, as support, raised her voice another notch. "Sir, step back while we verify this. Do not touch anything until we've cleared it." The way she said it, like he was dangerous, made Malcolm's chest burn. I'm a father, a husband, a leader, and to her, I'm a threat with a boarding pass. He bent slightly, retrieving his briefcase from the floor. Careful not to move too quickly. Immediately, Samantha barked. Don't touch that. The reaction was visceral. The older woman in 3C gasped. Daniel's eyes widened. Even Tyrell's viewers exploded with comments. He can't even grab his bag. This is racism live. Folks, stay calm. Bro, stay calm. Malcolm froze for a beat, then slowly straightened. His voice came steady, though inside his pulse raced. It's just documents, nothing else. Samantha crossed her arms tighter. We'll be the judge of that. The seconds stretched long. The tension in the cabin grew thick enough to choke on. And Malcolm knew this was only the beginning. Boarding time was ticking down. Departure loomed. And the spectacle had only just begun. The murmur inside the cabin thickened into an almost tangible fog. Everyone knew the flight was boarding late, and everyone knew why. The aisle had become a stage, the actors unwilling, the audience silent, but rapt. Samantha Price still held Malcolm Gray's boarding pass like a prosecutor clutching a piece of damning evidence. She had not returned it, and her posture made it clear she didn't intend to. Passengers fidgeted. A few were bold enough to whisper, though the quiet buzz carried easily in the enclosed space. What's going on? Someone muttered from row 6. Another voice answered softly. Some guy's trying to sit in first class with a fake ticket. The rumor spread with frightening speed. Within minutes, Malcolm's reputation among complete strangers had been poisoned by nothing more than Samantha's tone of voice. Then came the click of heels on the jet bridge. The sound grew louder, sharper, and carried a weight of authority before the woman even appeared. Caroline Evans, the gate manager, stepped into the cabin with her clipboard clutched like a badge. Her silver-streaked hair was tied back tightly, her expression crisp, as though she had already reached her conclusion before hearing a word. What's the situation here? She asked, her voice cold, rehearsed from years of repeating the same question to countless boarding delays. Samantha answered quickly, eager to secure her version of the story. This passenger is claiming ownership of seat 2A. His boarding pass appears suspicious. We believe it may be stolen or forged. Caroline's gaze slid to Malcolm, and in that instant, he felt the weight of another judgment. Her eyes traveled from his hoodie to his sneakers, then to the worn leather briefcase at his feet. Nothing about the examination suggested curiosity. It was confirmation. Confirmation of what she already wanted to believe. Sir, Caroline said, her voice firm, I understand you'd like to sit in first class, but we do have strict protocols. If you can't provide legitimate proof of purchase for this ticket, I'll need to reassign you. Fortunately, we do have an available seat in premium economy. Her words dripped with false generosity, as though she were offering a gift rather than stripping him of what he had rightfully purchased. Malcolm's throat tightened. He could feel the stares on him, rows of strangers waiting to see how he would react. The businessman in 1A sighed again, muttering, "Let's just get this over with." Terrell's livestream comments grew angrier. She really just said, "Fortunately." They're downgrading him like they're doing him a favor. This is premium racism. Malcolm looked at Caroline, then at Samantha, who still stood beside her like a shadow. His voice was even, deliberate. "I would prefer to keep my assigned seat." A flicker of irritation crossed Caroline's face. She tapped her pen against the clipboard with a little more force than necessary. "That's not how this works, sir. These seats are for paying customers. We're not running a charity." The words cut deep. A charity. As if his presence in that seat were a handout, an exception to the rule. For the first time, Malcolm felt the calm he had wrapped around himself begin to strain. Inside, the storm rose higher. He thought of the years spent negotiating contracts worth more than this plane itself. He thought of the nights when he worked until dawn, building Novatech from a basement startup into a tech powerhouse. And he thought of the irony how one of their biggest clients, this very airline, was now treating him as if he were trespassing. Still, he kept his voice measured. "My name is Malcolm Gray. My ticket is valid. I am not moving." Caroline's lips pressed into a thin line. "Then you leave me no choice but to escalate this. Sir, if you continue to resist, I'll have to call airport security." The words airport security rippled through the cabin like a chill breeze. Passengers shifted, some uncomfortable, others eager for the show to reach its climax. Terrell whispered into his phone's microphone, his voice trembling with both disbelief and adrenaline. "They're about to call security on a paying customer. This is wild. My viewer count's already over 80 people." Malcolm glanced at Terrell briefly, catching his eye. The young man gave him the faintest nod, a silent promise. "I've got this recorded. You're not alone." But that reassurance couldn't erase the heaviness pressing on his chest. He imagined how the reports would describe him afterward. Uncooperative passenger, possible fraud, escorted off the aircraft. He could see the words written in official ink, shaping the narrative that would follow him, no matter how false. He forced himself to breathe evenly. Calm. Always calm. But inside his thoughts battled each other. Why should I have to stay calm when they strip me of my dignity? Why is it my burden to prove I belong, over and over, while they face no consequence for assuming I don't? Caroline was already reaching for her radio. "Security to gate C-22. We need assistance with a non-compliant passenger." The label stung. Non-compliant. A word that carried weight far beyond this cabin. A word that had justified countless arrests, countless humiliations, countless lives derailed. Passengers leaned in again, some sympathetic, others indifferent. No one intervened. Silence was easier. Silence was safer. The businessman in 1A finally broke the hush. "Look, just give him the seat. We're going to be late." His voice carried impatience, not empathy, but at least it acknowledged the absurdity. Caroline turned sharply. "Sir, please stay out of this. We have procedures to follow." Malcolm stood straighter. His calmness now wasn't just armor. It was defiance. "Can I have your names and employee numbers?" he asked, his voice polite but unyielding. Samantha let out a laugh, brittle and mocking. "Report to who?" "The Better Business Bureau." "Good luck with that." Caroline smirked faintly, jotting something down on her clipboard. "Sir, you are in no position to be making reports. You'll be escorted off shortly." Terrell's livestream exploded with comments. "It's 2025, and this is still happening." Somebody tagged the news outlets. He's handling this like a king. In the cockpit. The captain would soon be told of the delay. Out on the tarmac, ground crew waited for the green light that wasn't coming. And in the cabin, time ticked mercilessly closer to departure, each minute swelling the tension thicker. Malcolm's mind raced. He weighed his options, each one a double-edged sword. If he complied, he would be humiliated. If he resisted, he would be branded a threat. If he revealed who he truly was, he would win the argument, but at the cost of exposing power he had never intended to flaunt. The choice loomed, heavy as lead. And he knew the next few minutes would define far more than just a single flight. The cabin had fallen into an uneasy hush, the kind of silence that comes right before a storm. Caroline Evans had just made the call for airport security, her voice clipped and professional, as though she were ordering a cup of coffee rather than summoning force against a paying passenger. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Passengers who had been murmuring moments ago now sat straighter, some with curiosity, others with unease. Malcolm Gray stood in the aisle, his boarding pass still held hostage in Samantha Price's hand. He had not raised his voice. He had not made a threatening move. Yet somehow, the entire cabin now saw him through the lens of suspicion planted by the crew. A pair of heavy boots echoed on the jet bridge. The sound grew closer, firmer, until two uniformed officers stepped onto the plane. The first was Officer Grant, broad-shouldered with lines of fatigue carved deep into his face. The second was Officer Blake, younger, sharper, his hand resting casually near the radio on his belt as if itching for a reason to use it. "What's the situation?" Grant asked Caroline, though his eyes immediately locked on Malcolm. Caroline answered quickly, eager to frame the narrative before Malcolm could open his mouth. "This passenger is refusing to move from a seat he cannot prove belongs to him. His documents are questionable. He's been non-compliant since boarding." The word landed again, heavy and damning. Non-compliant. Malcolm felt it pierce like a label branded onto his skin. Blake tilted his head towards Samantha. "This is the one, yes," she confirmed without hesitation. "He claims the ticket is his, but nothing about his story adds up. We believe it may have been purchased with a stolen credit card." The accusation hung in the air like poison. Around them, passengers stiffened, watching as if the cabin had turned into a courtroom. Grant stepped closer, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied Malcolm. "Sir, what's your name, Malcolm Gray?" came the calm reply. His voice was even, his shoulders squared, though inside his heart hammered against his ribs. Blake pulled out a small notepad, clicking his pen with deliberate slowness. "Mr. Gray, these folks are saying you don't belong in this seat. Are you willing to move voluntarily to avoid complications?" Tyrell Johnson's live stream caught the exchange. The viewer count shot past 200. Comments scrolled rapidly. They really just asked him to move when he has the ticket. This is insane. 2025, and still the same story. "Stay calm, brother. The world is watching." Malcolm inhaled, steadying himself. "I paid for seat 2A. I'd prefer to keep it." Grant sighed, rubbing his forehead like a man already weary from too many incidents that morning. "Look, sir, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. No one wants trouble before takeoff." Malcolm caught the subtext. Easy meant surrender. Hard meant force. Neither option acknowledged his dignity. Neither option accepted the truth. He looked at Caroline, at Samantha, then back at the officers. "Could I ask for your names and badge numbers?" His tone was polite, but the firmness beneath it was unmistakable. Samantha let out a laugh, high-pitched and mocking. "You think this is a negotiation, sir? You're about to be removed from the plane. Reports and badge numbers won't change that." Caroline smirked, scribbling on her clipboard. "Let's keep this moving. We're wasting everyone's time," the businessman in 1A muttered under his breath. "We're definitely going to miss our departure slot." His words were meant for no one, but they added to the pressure in the cabin, reinforcing the idea that Malcolm was the cause of delay, not the baseless assumptions surrounding him. Inside, Malcolm's mind raced. He could see how the narrative was being shaped in real time. He was being framed as a problem, a disruption, a man who did not know his place. He thought of all the boardrooms he had stood in, where investors had doubted his capabilities until he showed them the numbers that silenced every doubt. He thought of his team at Novatech, who relied on him to lead with composure, no matter how hostile the environment became. Still, a part of him ached with exhaustion. Why must I prove myself again and again? Why must every space I enter require validation beyond what others are asked to show? Blake shifted his weight, his voice firmer now. "Sir, let me be clear. We can escort you quietly, or this can escalate. Which way do you want it to go?" The passengers leaned in, breathless with anticipation. Some looked uneasy, others intrigued, as though they were watching a play reach its climax. None of them spoke up. Their silence was complicity. Their comfort prioritized over justice. Tyrell's voice whispered urgently into his phone. "They're about to drag him out. I'm recording everything. This is history in real time." Malcolm's eyes flicked to the young man again. That small act of witness gave him strength. Someone would remember this moment accurately. Someone would carry the truth beyond these walls. He drew in a long breath. Calm, always calm. But calm did not mean passive. Calm could be resistance, too. "Officers," Malcolm said evenly, "I am not refusing to cooperate. I am refusing to surrender a seat that I rightfully purchased. There is a difference." Grant's brow furrowed slightly, a flicker of doubt in his tired eyes, but Blake's stance hardened. "We don't have time for speeches. You need to move." "Sir?" Samantha's lips curved in a triumphant smile. Caroline's pen scratched faster against her clipboard. The machinery of authority had locked into place, and Malcolm stood alone against it. Inside his chest, the battle raged. Part of him wanted to sit down quietly, to avoid humiliation, to protect himself from what might come next. Another part roared against the injustice, demanding he stand firm, demanding he show the world that dignity was not negotiable. He thought of his daughter again, her small voice asking him last week why some kids at school treated her differently. He thought of his promise to her, "You are never less than anyone else." And he realized this was not just about him. This was about the promise he had made, the example he had to set. Grant spoke again, his tone heavy. "Mr. Gray, final chance. Step out with us, or we'll have to remove you." The cabin seemed to hold its breath. Tyrell's livestream surged past 400 viewers, comments flashing faster than he could read them. "Don't give in. You're right. Man, this is making me sick. They can't keep getting away with this." Malcolm's heart pounded, but his voice remained steady. "Then you will have to remove me, because I am not moving by choice." The declaration stunned the silence even deeper. Samantha blinked, momentarily thrown off. Caroline's smirk faltered. Even Blake hesitated, his pen hovering over the notepad. For the first time, the balance of power shifted slightly, not fully, but enough for the audience to feel it. Malcolm had refused the script. He had written his own line. And in that moment, though he was still outnumbered, still surrounded, still at risk, he was not defeated. The cabin door hissed as it closed briefly against the noise of the jet bridge. The steady hum of the engines seemed louder in the tense silence. Every passenger was waiting for the next move, their eyes darting between the officers and the man in the hoodie who refused to back down. Then, the sound of polished shoes echoed against the narrow aisle. Captain Andrew Foster emerged from the cockpit, his Navy uniform crisp, cap tucked neatly under his arm. His jaw was set with irritation. This was a man already calculating the minutes of delay, already feeling the pressure of schedules and departure slots slipping away. "What's the holdup here?" Foster asked, his voice cutting through the tension. He scanned the aisle, his gaze briefly touching each face before settling on Caroline Evans, the gate manager. Caroline wasted no time. "Captain, this passenger is causing a disruption. He refuses to move to economy class where he belongs. His ticket is suspicious. We've already called security for assistance." The phrasing was deliberate. She had framed it neatly, placing the blame squarely on Malcolm Gray. Foster didn't question it, not immediately. He turned toward Malcolm, his eyes hard, the kind of stare that expected obedience. "Sir," Foster said, "I need you to cooperate with my crew. Find an available seat in the back, and we can sort this out after we land." The words hit Malcolm like a familiar sting. Cooperate. A word that sounded reasonable, but carried the weight of compliance demanded without cause. Malcolm stood tall, his voice calm but firm. "Captain, with respect, I have an assigned seat, 2A, and I would like to keep it." Foster's expression hardened. "Mr. Gray, I don't have time for games. Either you move voluntarily, or security can escort you off my aircraft entirely. Your choice." The threat lingered in the recycled air, heavy and suffocating. Security shifted slightly, hands resting closer to their belts. Samantha Price stood off to the side, arms crossed, a smirk tugging at her lips like victory was already hers. Caroline scribbled something on her clipboard, ready to file the incident away as another non-compliant passenger. Passengers leaned in. A few filmed discreetly. Most pretended not to look, their magazines and phones suddenly very interesting. Silence was safer than confrontation. Silence was complicity. Tyrell Johnson's live stream, however, was anything but silent. His phone buzzed with a flood of comments. "This is discrimination, plain and simple. He literally has the ticket. What else do they want?" Somebody tagged the airline's Twitter. "Get this trending." The viewer count spiked past 900, then 1,000. The world outside the cabin was beginning to pay attention. Inside, Malcolm's mind was a battlefield. He could feel the pressure of 5 authority figures closing in on him. 2 flight attendants, a gate manager, 2 security officers, and now the captain himself. He was outnumbered, framed as the problem, cornered in a narrow aisle with nowhere to go. He thought of his employees back at Novatech, hundreds of them who trusted him to lead with calmness and courage. He thought of the meetings he had tomorrow in San Francisco, where contracts worth millions depended on his presence. And he thought of his family, his daughter who would one day face the same battles, his wife who had begged him to remain patient with the world's ignorance. His voice stayed even, but inside he questioned himself. "Am I making this worse? Should I just move? What will they do to me if I resist any further grant?" The older security officer shifted uncomfortably. He had seen plenty of situations like this before, passengers angry about seating, customers refusing to comply. But something about Malcolm's composure unsettled him. This man did not look like a scammer. He looked like someone who had nothing to prove. yet was being forced to prove everything. Blake, on the other hand, seemed eager. "Captain, we can remove him now. It won't take more than a minute." The businessman in 1A finally spoke up, exasperated. "Look, just let him sit down. We're all tired of this." But Foster raised a hand sharply, silencing him. "Sir, stay out of this. We're handling it." Caroline looked pleased. Samantha's smirk widened. Malcolm breathed in slowly. His chest felt tight, his briefcase heavy at his feet. He knew what was inside could change everything, but to reveal it meant pulling out the very power he had hoped not to wield. It meant proving himself in a way no one else in that cabin had to. Still, the weight of the decision pressed against him. Do I let them strip my dignity just to avoid conflict? Or do I show them who I am and force them to see the truth? His voice broke the silence. "Captain Foster, before you make that final decision, may I request your full name and employee number for documentation?" Samantha laughed outright this time. "Document this for who your imaginary lawyer Caroline joined in with a thin smile." "Sir, you're not in a position to make demands. You're minutes away from being removed," Terrell whispered into his phone. "They're laughing at him." "Y'all, this is humiliating." Malcolm kept his gaze on Foster. The captain hesitated, just for a moment, as though he recognized that this passenger was different, too calm, too deliberate, not the kind of man who bluffed without reason. "Still," Foster pressed on, "Mr. Gray, this is your last chance. Move to the back, or you will be escorted off the plane." The silence stretched. Passengers held their breath. Security shifted closer. Blake's hand hovered near Malcolm's arm. Samantha looked ready to celebrate. Caroline scribbled notes as though the conclusion were already written. Malcolm closed his eyes briefly, inhaling deeply. Then he opened them, his calm gaze steady as a stone. "If you insist, Captain, I will show you something, but it may change your perspective on this entire situation." He crouched slowly, carefully, reaching for his briefcase. At once Blake stiffened, his hand darting toward his radio. "Keep your hands where we can see them." The reaction was immediate and revealing. The assumption was that his briefcase was dangerous, that his movement itself was a threat. The same action by the businessman in 1A would have gone unnoticed. "It's just documents," Malcolm said quietly, his hand still on the latch. "Would you like to see them?" The cabin was silent, all eyes fixed on the briefcase. Captain Foster's irritation warred with curiosity. "Go ahead," he said finally. "Show me what's in there." The moment stretched, heavy and charged. Malcolm opened the briefcase slowly, deliberately. Inside, neatly arranged folders, company letterhead, contracts, and polished business cards caught the cabin lights. He pulled out a single document, marked with the corporate seal of Novatech Systems. His hand extended it toward the captain. "Just one document. Captain Foster. I believe it will clarify things." The captain hesitated, then took it. His eyes scanned the first lines. His expression shifted almost instantly. The irritation faded, replaced by a tightening around his eyes, a slight pause in his breathing. Passengers craned their necks, trying to see what had changed. Terrell whispered to his phone. "This is it, y'all." He's been too calm. He had something up his sleeve. Foster's face went pale. His eyes moved quickly over the contract, his lips pressing tighter as he read. He looked back up at Malcolm, his voice quieter now, carrying a note of unease. "Mr. Gray, I had no idea." The cabin, already tense, seemed to tilt in a new direction. Samantha's smirk faltered. Caroline's pen froze mid-note. Even Blake, still holding his radio, looked momentarily lost, and Malcolm simply stood there, calm as ever, watching the balance of power begin, slowly, to shift. Captain Andrew Foster's hands trembled slightly as he held the document Malcolm Gray had presented. The heavy paper bore Novatech Systems' corporate seal, and the words leapt off the page like a verdict. Strategic Partnership Agreement with the airline's logo stamped beside it. A contract worth tens of millions of dollars. The captain's face drained of color as he skimmed the lines. He had walked into the cabin ready to have Malcolm removed, ready to end what he thought was a petty disruption. Now, the very foundation of his assumption cracked beneath him. Passengers leaned forward, restless and curious. They could sense the shift, even if they didn't know why. Samantha Price tilted her head, her smirk fading as uncertainty crept into her features. Caroline Evans straightened her clipboard as though holding it tighter could restore her authority. Officer Blake frowned, still gripping his radio, unsure if he should act. Foster cleared his throat, the authority in his voice thinning. "Mr. Gray, I didn't realize." Malcolm didn't flinch. He stood steady, his eyes calm, his tone measured. "Captain Foster, I told you, my seat is 2A, and I am not moving." For a moment, the silence was absolute. No one spoke, no one breathed too loudly. Then the businessman in 1A muttered, not quite under his breath, "Well, damn." Tyrell Johnson's livestream crackled with excitement. The comments poured in so fast they blurred on the screen. "What's happening?" He showed them papers. Look at the captain's face. Oh, snap. He's someone important. The viewer count climbed past 1,500. The internet was hungry, and it was devouring every second. Caroline Evans tried to recover. "Captain, regardless of what documents he may have, protocol still requires verification. We cannot Foster cut her off." His voice sharper than before. "Caroline, I can handle this." She froze, lips pressed thin. The shift of power was unmistakable. Samantha, however, refused to surrender. "Captain, with respect, this passenger still hasn't proven he purchased the ticket himself. Fraudulent documents can look very convincing." Her voice was louder than necessary, projecting to the rows of passengers as if to reclaim the narrative. Some nodded along uneasily, others frowned, realizing her tone no longer fit the moment. Malcolm exhaled slowly. He had given them a chance to see him as he was a man with proof, with power, with calm dignity. But still, suspicion clung to him. Still, they searched for ways to invalidate his presence. Inside, his mind churned. Do I reveal more? Do I strip away the last layer of privacy and show them everything just to be believed? How many times must I prove I belong? His heartbeat quickened. This was the breaking point. "Captain," Malcolm said, his voice low but steady, "would you like to know why I carry this document with me?" Foster hesitated, his pride as captain warred with the dawning realization that this man might hold more power than the entire crew combined. Finally, curiosity won. "Go ahead." Malcolm's eyes swept across the cabin. "Because I've learned that no matter how much you achieve, no matter what you build, there will always be those who see only what they want to see. A hoodie, a skin color, a man out of place. And I carry proof because sometimes proof is the only thing that silences doubt." The words cut through the cabin like a blade. Some passengers lowered their eyes, ashamed. Others looked defensive, unwilling to acknowledge the truth. Tyrell whispered into his phone, "He's preaching right now. Y'all hear that his live stream exploded with comments. Goosebumps. That hit me. This man is a boss. They can't ignore him now. Malcolm paused, letting the silence stretch. His pulse pounded in his ears, but outwardly he remained unshaken. Calm. Always calm. Then he reached back into his briefcase. Blake stiffened, his hand snapping toward his belt again. Sir, I said keep your hands. Relax, Grant interrupted, his weary voice finally pushing back against his younger partner. Let him finish. Malcolm pulled out a second folder, sliding it onto the captain's palm. Foster scanned the header. His jaw slackened. Novatech Systems wasn't just a vendor. They were responsible for the airline's upcoming booking infrastructure, for the very system that would soon run every ticket, every upgrade, every flight. And then Foster's eyes caught the clause, Section 12.4, Partner Dignity Clause. Any discriminatory treatment of Novatech personnel constituted a material breach of contract, subject to immediate termination and multi-million-dollar penalties. Foster's lips moved soundlessly as he reread the words. His stomach sank. If this incident became official, if Malcolm reported what had just occurred, the airline would be facing not just embarrassment, but financial disaster. Caroline's pen slipped from her fingers. Samantha's smirk dissolved into a mask of disbelief. Blake's grip on his radio loosened, his eagerness dampened by the gravity of what he was hearing. Malcolm's voice broke the stunned silence. So, Captain, tell me, am I still a suspicious passenger, or am I a partner whose dignity your airline is contractually obligated to respect? The question hung heavy, impossible to dodge. Foster swallowed hard. His authority, once unquestionable, now teetered on the edge. The cabin waited for his response. Before he could speak, Samantha blurted out, "This was just a misunderstanding. We were following security protocols. No harm intended." Her words fell flat. They sounded hollow, desperate. Passengers shook their heads. Tyrell's live stream chat roasted her mercilessly. Now she's backtracking. Might a misunderstanding. She humiliated him for 15 minutes. Too late for excuses. Malcolm's chest rose and fell in measured rhythm. Inside, though, the conflict raged. He didn't feel triumphant. He didn't feel vindicated. Instead, a heavy sadness pressed down on him. Sadness that it had come to this, that only power and money could force recognition of his humanity. His thoughts spiraled inward. What about the people who don't carry contracts worth millions in their briefcases? What about those without titles, without leverage? Who defends them when suspicion alone can strip away their dignity? He thought of his father, who had once been forced to leave a restaurant because the manager didn't believe he could afford the meal. He thought of his younger self, standing in department stores with clerks trailing him through the aisles. And now, here he was, decades later, still carrying the burden of proof. Foster finally found his voice, though it trembled. "Mr. Gray, I deeply regret what has happened." Malcolm tilted his head slightly. His eyes stayed fixed on the captain. "Regret is easy, Captain. Change is harder." The cabin exhaled as if it had been holding its breath. Passengers shifted, murmuring. Some looked at Malcolm with newfound respect, others with discomfort. But the truth had been laid bare, and there was no rewinding what had been said. Tyrell's phone buzzed with notifications. His viewer count soared past 3,000. Comments flew. Legendary. This man just flipped the script. Airline about to pay big time. Malcolm closed his briefcase slowly, deliberately. The breaking point had passed. He had stood his ground, revealed his truth, and forced the system to look him in the eye. But deep inside, he knew this was far from over. The storm had only just begun. Captain Andrew Foster held the contract in his hands as if it were a piece of burning coal. Ming. The more he read, the more he realized the magnitude of the mistake unraveling before his eyes. His entire crew had humiliated a man whose company practically held the airline's future in its grip. The cabin was still thick with tension. Samantha Price had lost her confident posture, her arms no longer crossed but hanging stiffly by her sides. Caroline Evans kept adjusting her clipboard, though she wasn't writing anything. Officer Grant studied the scene with weary caution, while Officer Blake stood frozen, the swagger drained from his stance. Passengers leaned toward the aisle, curiosity painted across their faces. None of them spoke, but their silence now felt different, less complicit, more expectant. They wanted to know what would happen next. Malcolm Gray stood with his briefcase closed once more, calm but unyielding. His eyes stayed on the captain, waiting. Foster cleared his throat, though his voice carried none of the authority it had minutes earlier. "Mr. Gray, I truly had no idea." Malcolm's response was quiet but piercing. "And that is the problem. Captain, you didn't ask. You assumed." The words hung in the air like a verdict. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably. Others nodded almost imperceptibly. Samantha's jaw tightened as though she wanted to argue, but the weight of the truth pressed her lips shut. Tyrrell Johnson's phone buzzed with constant notifications. His live stream was now over 5,000 viewers strong, the comments scrolling faster than he could track. "The captain is folding. He finally gets it. This is bigger than just one seat." Foster glanced again at the document, then back at Malcolm. "You're the CEO of Novatech Systems." It was not a question. "That's correct," Malcolm confirmed. "And your company handles our new booking system." Foster's voice faltered. "As well as training protocols?" Malcolm nodded once. "Yes." "Including bias training?" "Ironically, designed to prevent exactly what has just taken place." A ripple of gas spread among the passengers. Even those who had tried to remain detached could not ignore the bitter irony. Caroline Evans spoke up finally, her voice brittle. "Mr. Gray, this was never personal. We were only following procedures to ensure security." "You must understand," Malcolm's gaze snapped to her, sharp and unflinching. "Security or prejudice disguised as protocol." Caroline's words died in her throat. The silence that followed was suffocating. Samantha stepped forward then, desperation breaking through her veneer. "Look, I was just doing my job. We've seen cases of fraud before. I couldn't risk letting someone sit in first class without verifying." Malcolm's voice lowered, calm but cutting. "Fraud is possible. But you didn't question the man in 1A when he boarded. You didn't ask the woman in 3C for extra verification. You looked at me, in a hoodie, and decided I didn't belong. That's not procedure. That's prejudice." The statement rang in the cabin like a bell. Several passengers lowered their heads. The businessman in 1A shifted uncomfortably, as though ashamed he had stayed silent for so long. Tyrrell's live stream chat erupted. "Say it louder. He's calling out the truth. This is history right here." Foster rubbed the back of his neck, the weight of the situation sinking deeper. He had entered ready to enforce authority. Now he was realizing authority had been misplaced, abused, weaponized against the wrong man. Malcolm's chest rose and fell evenly. But inside, he wrestled with a storm of emotions. He had revealed his position, his power, the leverage no one in this cabin had imagined he possessed. But instead of satisfaction, he felt a hollow ache. Why must it always take proof of wealth, proof of status, proof of power for dignity to be acknowledged? What about the man who cannot pull a multi-million-dollar contract from his briefcase? What about the woman who only has her voice and nothing else? His thoughts spiraled inward. He could see his father's hands, calloused from years of labor, holding a paycheck that was never enough yet still deserving of respect. He could see his daughter's innocent eyes, still learning what the world might take from her. Malcolm steadied himself. This was not just about him. This was about them, about everyone who had ever been forced to explain their existence, to justify their worth. "Captain," he said finally, his tone controlled, "I am not interested in apologies. I am interested in accountability. What assurances can you give me that this does not happen again to me or to anyone else who looks like me?" The captain faltered. His mouth opened, then closed. His authority was crumbling, and the eyes of the cabin demanded more than hollow regret. Before he could answer, Officer Grant cleared his throat. His voice was low, weary but firm. "With all due respect, Captain, he's right. This wasn't handled correctly. We came in assuming guilt instead of asking questions." The admission stunned the cabin. Even Blake looked at his partner in surprise. Grant continued, his gaze steady on Malcolm. "I've been doing this for over 20 years. I know the difference between someone causing trouble and someone standing their ground. This man isn't the problem. The problem started before we even walked on." Passengers murmured. Some nodded in agreement. The businessman in 1A finally spoke louder. "He's right. This has been ridiculous from the start." For the first time, Malcolm felt the tide shifting, not just because of his documents, but because others were finding their voices. Too late, perhaps, but voices nonetheless. Carolyn's hands trembled on her clipboard. Samantha's face was pale, her earlier bravado stripped bare. Blake shifted uncomfortably, unsure where to stand now that his partner had spoken truth. Malcolm exhaled. The revelation was not just that he was powerful. The revelation was that their actions had been recorded, witnessed, and now challenged in real time by thousands of viewers and by the very officer called to enforce their bias. Terrell whispered urgently into his phone. "Y'all, did you hear that the officer admitted they were wrong? This is huge." His viewer count soared past 7,000. Screenshots and clips were already spreading across platforms. Malcolm bent, retrieved his boarding pass from Samantha's reluctant hand, and slipped it calmly into his wallet. The gesture was small, but it carried the weight of vindication. Then he looked at the captain again. "I am taking my seat now. When we land, we will discuss what accountability looks like. But make no mistake, Captain, there will be accountability." The cabin was silent, the kind of silence that comes after an earthquake, when everyone is still absorbing the aftershocks. Malcolm walked to 2A, set his briefcase carefully under the seat, and lowered himself into the leather chair he had paid for. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, as if to reclaim the dignity that had been denied him for the past 20 minutes. The revelation was complete. He was not just another passenger. He was the man who had turned their assumptions into a mirror, forcing them to see the reflection they tried to deny. But even as he settled into his seat, his mind whispered with unease. If this is what it takes for them to see me, what happens to those who have no briefcase, no contract, no power? The storm was far from over. Oh. The first-class cabin felt heavier than the pressurized air around it. Passengers remained glued to the scene, some shifting uncomfortably, others staring openly at Malcolm Gray, as if seeing him for the first time. He sat now in 2A, his rightful seat, shoulders squared, his briefcase tucked beneath him like a shield. But the air was not cleared. If anything, the weight of unspoken truths pressed harder. Captain Andrew Foster lingered in the aisle, the partnership contract still trembling slightly in his hand. He knew the situation had gone far beyond a seating dispute. It was now a corporate and moral crisis wrapped into one. Samantha Price stood frozen near the galley. The smirk that had carried her through the confrontation was gone. In its place was a pale unease that tightened her jaw. Caroline Evans clutched her clipboard, her knuckles whitening as though gripping it could preserve her authority. Terrell Johnson whispered into his phone's mic, voice hushed but urgent. "He's in his seat now." "Y'all." The captain shook. "I think they realize who he is." "This isn't over, though." His viewer count ticked past 10,000. Comments filled his feed. "She better apologize. That flight attendant is finished. Respect this man. Period." The silence broke with Captain Foster's voice. His tone was lower now, stripped of command. "Mr. Gray, I owe you an apology. What happened here was unacceptable." All eyes flicked to Malcolm. He studied the captain, expression unreadable. An apology is a start, Captain, but apologies without accountability are just words. Foster's throat tightened. He nodded once, recognizing the truth in the statement. But before he could respond further, Samantha stepped forward. Her hands trembled slightly, her voice pitched with a mix of defensiveness and regret. "Mr. Gray, I'm sorry. I made assumptions. I shouldn't have treated you the way I did. I thought I was doing my job." But she faltered, swallowing hard. "But I see now it was more than that. It was prejudice, and it was wrong." The admission startled the cabin. A few passengers gasped softly. Others exchanged glances, surprised at the bluntness of her words. Terrell whispered into his phone. She admitted it. She actually admitted it. The live stream chat exploded. Did she just say that out loud? Respect to her for owning it, but damage is done. Apology don't fix humiliation. Malcolm leaned back slightly in his seat, his gaze steady on Samantha. His voice was calm, but laced with quiet weight. "Do you understand what you did? For 15 minutes, you stripped me of dignity in front of strangers. You framed me as a thief, a fraud, a man who didn't belong, all because of how I looked." Samantha's eyes brimmed with something that might have been tears, though she fought to keep them back. I didn't think. I just reacted. And that reaction was wrong. Malcolm's jaw tightened. Reactions are learned. You didn't invent that prejudice in this moment. You carried it here, and today it chose me as its target. His words landed like stones in water, rippling through the cabin. Several passengers looked down at their hands, the weight of complicity pressing in. The businessman in 1A shifted, then finally spoke. His voice was quiet, almost ashamed. "I should have said something. I saw it happening, and I stayed silent. I'm sorry, too." The older woman in 3C nodded slowly. "So did I. I was uncomfortable, but I didn't speak up. I should have." The small confessions added to the chorus of discomfort. It was no longer just about Samantha. It was about everyone who had watched and said nothing. Terrell's live stream buzzed louder. His comments scrolled with a mix of praise and outrage. Finally, people admitting silence is complicity. Respect to the passengers speaking up, but way too late. This is why we need cameras. Otherwise, he'd be gone already. Malcolm's chest rose and fell in steady rhythm. He heard their words, but he did not let them absolve themselves so easily. It is easy to apologize when the truth is undeniable. It is harder to act in the moment, when silence feels safer. Remember that the next time you see someone's dignity stripped away. The businessman lowered his head. The woman in 3C dabbed her eyes with a tissue. Samantha took a tentative step closer. Mr. Gray, I know my words can't undo what I did, but I need you to know that I am truly sorry. For a long moment, Malcolm said nothing. His mind wrestled with conflicting emotions. He saw sincerity in her face, but he also saw the trail of harm behind her. He thought of the humiliation, the whispers, the stares. He thought of the fact that she only now, confronted with his power, found her voice to apologize. If I had been anyone else, would she still feel this remorse? Or would she write the report, laugh about it in the crew lounge, and move on? Finally, Malcolm spoke. Your apology matters, but what matters more is what you do after this. If all you take from this is regret, nothing changes. If you choose to learn, then perhaps this humiliation serves a purpose. Samantha nodded, her face pale. I will learn. I promise. Carolyn Evans, still gripping her clipboard, cleared her throat. Mr. Gray. Her voice cracked, but she forced it steady. I mishandled this as well. I believe my employee without question. I looked at you and decided you did not belong. That was my failure, and I am sorry. Her words lacked Samantha's vulnerability, but the admission still rippled through the cabin. Malcolm's eyes narrowed slightly. Gate managers are trained to lead, to assess fairly. You failed to lead. That failure endangered not only me, but your airline. Caroline's chin dropped. I accept that. Captain Foster finally spoke again, his voice heavier than before. Mr. Gray, what happened here will not be ignored. I assure you, there will be consequences for this crew, and reforms will be discussed at the highest level. Malcolm studied him, his gaze unwavering. Good, because consequences without reform are punishment. Reform without consequences is a performance. You will need both. The captain nodded, swallowing the truth. For a moment, the cabin fell quiet again. Then the businessman in 1A spoke louder, his voice clearer now. Mr. Gray, for what it's worth, you handled this with more grace than most of us would have. I respect that. Malcolm gave a faint nod, though his expression remained serious. Inside, his thoughts whispered bitterly. Grace should not be the price of survival. Tyrell's live stream ticked past 12,000 viewers. Comments flooded, and man is teaching them and the world right now. This needs to go viral. History lesson at 30,000 feet. Malcolm leaned back into his seat. The apologies had been spoken, the consequences promised. Yet a hollowness remained in his chest. Apologies did not erase humiliation. Promises did not erase history. But perhaps, just perhaps, they planted the seed of change. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, centering himself. His thoughts drifted to his daughter. When she faces her battles, will she see a world that has learned from mine? Or will she still be forced to carry proof of her worth in her hands? The storm had quieted, but only for now. The silence in the first-class cabin stretched long after the apologies had been spoken. But outside those pressurized walls, the world was already stirring. Tyrell Johnson's live stream had crossed 15,000 viewers, clips spreading across TikTok, Twitter, and Instagram faster than the crew could blink. What had begun as a humiliating confrontation was now unfolding into a viral moment with consequences far larger than anyone inside the aircraft could yet imagine. Tyrrell whispered urgently into his phone, "Y'all, we're trending. People already tagging the airline, posting screenshots of the contract he pulled out. This is going way beyond this flight." His comments exploded. Tag the CEO. Tag the board. This airline about to lose millions. Respect to this brother for staying calm under fire. Malcolm Gray sat quietly in 2A, his back straight, hands folded lightly in his lap. On the surface, he appeared calm, but inside, he was still battling the storm. He thought about how quickly his dignity had been stripped away, how easily suspicion had replaced respect, and how fragile even power could feel when faced with prejudice. Captain Andrew Foster remained near the aisle, his eyes fixed on the contract in his hands. Every line he had read replayed in his mind. Section 12, 4. The partner dignity clause stood out like a neon sign. If Malcolm filed a formal report, the airline could be in breach of a multi-million-dollar contract. His career would not escape scrutiny either. Foster's hand tightened on the paper, his stomach knotting. Caroline Evans stared down at her clipboard, unable to meet anyone's eyes. She had built her career on efficiency and authority, yet tonight her authority had collapsed under the weight of her own assumptions. Samantha Price, once smug and unyielding, now lingered near the galley, her pale face tight with fear. The word apology clung to her lips, but she knew it was not enough. Passengers, too, were shifting. The businessman in 1A had grown restless, muttering to himself about lawsuits and stock prices. The older woman in 3C held her tissue tightly, her guilt evident. A young college student in 5D quietly texted, her fingers flying across the screen as she updated friends about what was happening live. Then, a ripple of realization swept the cabin. Several passengers refreshed their phones, their screens lighting up with headlines. CEO humiliated on United flight discrimination or protocol. Viral video sparks outrage Novatech partnership in jeopardy. After racial profiling incident, murmurs spread as passengers showed each other their screens. The incident had already leapt beyond the aircraft, and now every decision made here would be scrutinized by the entire world. Samantha's voice trembled as she finally spoke again. "Captain, what do we do?" Foster's eyes remained on the contract. His jaw clenched. "What we do is handle this before it destroys the company." Malcolm's calm voice interrupted. "The company is already in the storm. Captain, what matters now is how it chooses to respond." His words stilled the air. Even Grant, the weary security officer, looked at Malcolm with a kind of respect that hadn't been there before. Blake, still holding his radio, shifted nervously. "Captain, we're past departure. Do we keep delaying?" Foster exhaled sharply, the weight of command pressing on his shoulders. "We are not departing until this is resolved. If we leave now, this will explode before we land." Malcolm leaned forward slightly in his seat. His voice was calm but deliberate, each word precise. "It is already exploding. The question is whether you will choose damage control or meaningful accountability." The businessman in 1A muttered louder now, clearly speaking for the growing unease of passengers. "Look, just make it right so we can move. Nobody wants to be stuck here while corporate politics play out." Malcolm turned his head slightly, his eyes locking on the man. "This isn't just politics. This is dignity. If you are more concerned about a schedule than the humanity of a fellow passenger, then perhaps you are part of the problem." The man looked down, chastened. Though his cheeks flushed with quiet embarrassment, Tyrrell whispered into his phone, "Did you hear that he just checked him? Respect?" His comment feed swelled. "This man is teaching everyone on that plane. Never seen composure like this. I'd vote for him if he ran for office." Caroline finally spoke, her voice low, stripped of confidence. "Mr. Gray, what do you want from us right here, right now?" Malcolm's eyes softened, though his voice remained steady. "What I want is simple. My seat, which I already have, respect, which I had to demand, and assurances that this does not happen again. Not to me, not to anyone." Samantha's lips parted as if to respond, but she said nothing. The truth was undeniable. Captain Foster's phone buzzed sharply on his belt. He pulled it free, glanced at the screen, and paled further. The airline's operations center was calling. He stepped a few feet away, lowered his voice, but passengers near the front still caught fragments. Viral already. Breach of contract. Board involvement. Immediate response required. When he returned, his face was taut, his composure visibly cracking. He looked at Malcolm, then at Caroline, then finally at the rows of passengers whose eyes bored into him. "Mr. Gray," Foster began, his voice quieter now. "Our executive office is aware of what has happened. They will want to speak with you directly when we land. Until then, I want to make sure you are treated with the respect you deserve." The cabin buzzed with murmurs. Passengers exchanged glances. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others nodded, recognizing the power had shifted completely. Malcolm's eyes didn't waver. "Respect is not a temporary adjustment. Captain, it is a permanent standard. If your airline wants to salvage this, it will need more than apologies whispered in a cabin. It will need systemic change." Foster opened his mouth to reply, but before he could, Tyrrell whispered into his phone, "We're past 17,000 viewers now. Hashtags trending #3 in the country." His grin spread despite the tension. "This thing is blowing up." Samantha flinched at his words. She knew her face was already online, her name likely circulating in comments, her 12 years of spotless service unraveling in minutes. Caroline's fingers trembled around her clipboard. Even Blake, usually cocky, avoided the gaze of passengers who looked at him with judgment. Grant, the older officer, sighed deeply. He looked at Malcolm, his eyes carrying both apology and fatigue. "Sir, for what it's worth, I respect how you handled this. A lot of people would have lost their composure. You didn't. You made us all face ourselves." Malcolm gave a faint nod. "Thank you, but it should not take composure to be treated fairly. Dignity is not earned. It is inherent." The line struck the cabin like thunder. Even Tyrrell's viewers paused their rapid comments to type variations of the same thing. Dignity is not earned. It is inherent. Somebody put that on a billboard. Bars. Pure bars. The tide had turned. The crew knew it. The captain knew it. The passengers knew it. And Malcolm, though still burdened by the weight of what had transpired, understood that this was no longer just about him. It was about everyone who would come after him, sitting in a seat they had paid for, daring to exist in spaces others thought they didn't belong. The flight had not even left the ground, but the world was already watching, and the balance of power had shifted for good. By the time Captain Andrew Foster returned the contract to Malcolm Gray, the outside world was already running faster than the aircraft engines ever could. News cycles had picked up Tyrrell Johnson's live stream, clipping the most humiliating and powerful moments into short bursts replayed endlessly online. On Twitter, the hashtag United Discrimination had surged to #1 nationally. On TikTok, The clip of Samantha Price snatching Malcolm's boarding pass had already crossed 1 million views, stitched with captions like "Flying While Black in 2025" and "CEO Humiliated." Then drops the contract. Instagram reels showed passengers whispering, the briefcase opening, the captain's pale face. Every platform carried the same story, a calm black CEO exposing an airline's prejudice in real time. But inside the cabin, Malcolm remained still. He sat in 2A, his back pressed against the leather, his briefcase tucked carefully at his side. Outwardly calm, inwardly calculating. He knew what was happening beyond the cabin. His phone buzzed with notifications in his pocket. Hundreds of messages, no doubt, pouring in from board members, colleagues, journalists, but he let it buzz unanswered. His focus remained here, in this pressurized capsule of truth. Passengers scrolled furiously on their phones, whispering updates to each other. The businessman in 1A muttered about stock prices and corporate meltdowns. The college student in 5D grinned as she texted her group chat. "I'm on the flight that's trending. I can't believe this." The older woman in 3C wiped her eyes again, her guilt now mingled with awe. Samantha Price hovered near the galley, her hands shaking as she tried to rearrange beverage carts just to have something to do. But nothing could distract her from the weight pressing down. She knew her face was already viral. Every second she had spent smirking, every word dripping with prejudice, had been captured. She had wanted an audience in the cabin. Now she had one in the millions. Caroline Evans sat rigid in her jump seat, clipboard resting uselessly in her lap. Her authority had evaporated in front of passengers, crew, and now the entire world. She thought about her years of service, her carefully built reputation, her pending application for a senior corporate role. All of it now teetered on the edge of ruin. Captain Foster had returned to the cockpit briefly, his headset crackling with urgent voices from the airline's operations center. Executives were already scrambling, damage control spiraling into overdrive. Words like lawsuit, contract breach, termination clause, and shareholder liability ricocheted through his earpiece. By the time he returned to the cabin, his face carried the look of a man who knew his career was dangling by a thread. Malcolm's calm voice broke the murmurs. "Do you see now why accountability matters?" The cabin hushed again. Even passengers not directly involved leaned in, drawn to his steady tone. Had I not revealed who I was, I would be sitting in economy now, stripped of dignity, labeled a fraud, or worse, escorted off this plane, written up as a problem passenger. That report would follow me, damaging not just this flight, but everyone after. My life, my career, all vulnerable to one person's prejudice. This is not about a seat. It is about a system that protects bias until it is forced into the light. The passengers held still, the truth undeniable. The older woman in 3C whispered, "He's right. We all saw it," Terrell whispered into his phone. "History lesson in real time." "Y'all." His viewer count climbed past 20,000. The comments were relentless. "Man is dropping wisdom like a professor. Whole industry about to change. This is bigger than a contract. This is justice." Captain Foster cleared his throat, his authority thin but still necessary. "Mr. Gray, our executive team will meet with you immediately upon landing. They are prepared to take whatever measures are necessary to address this. The company recognizes the gravity of what has happened." Malcolm turned his head slightly, his expression calm, prepared to take measures, or prepared to minimize liability. The question cut like glass. Foster flinched, unable to deny the truth behind it. Malcolm's voice lowered. "Understand this. I have no interest in destroying careers for the sake of vengeance, but I will not allow this to be brushed aside as a misunderstanding. This will require real change." Grant, the older security officer, nodded slowly. "You're right, sir. Too often, we treat these things as isolated incidents. But the truth is, they're patterns, and patterns demand reform." Passengers glanced at him, surprised by his candor. Even Blake, his younger partner, looked stunned, but Grant's tired eyes carried conviction. Caroline finally found her voice again, though it shook. "Mr. Gray, what does accountability look like to you?" Malcolm exhaled, his eyes steady. "Accountability looks like recognition of the harm caused, systemic reform to prevent it from repeating, and transparency so that the public knows change is real, not cosmetic." His words carried the cadence of boardroom negotiations, but his tone carried the weight of lived experience. The businessman in 1A muttered again, but this time with more reflection than annoyance. If this goes public, the airline could lose millions, maybe billions. Malcolm's gaze flicked toward him. "Sometimes, the cost of doing nothing is far higher than the cost of change." The man fell silent. Phones buzzed again in the cabin as more headlines appeared. News outlets had identified Malcolm Gray, CEO of Novatech Systems. Articles quoted his company's multi-million-dollar contract with the airline, his influence in developing bias training programs, his role as a shareholder. The narrative was clear. A black CEO had been humiliated, and in trying to deny him dignity, the airline had stumbled into the very trap of systemic bias his company was hired to fix. Passengers stared at their screens in awe. One leaned toward another, whispering, "He's about to change the whole industry." Tyrell's live stream viewers pushed past 30,000. His comments filled with hashtags now trending across multiple platforms. "To dignity clause, or accountability, now." Flying while black. Samantha finally broke her silence again. Her voice was raw, stripped of bravado. "Mr. Gray, I know nothing I say will undo what I did, but if there's any way to prove I can learn from this, I don't want my career to end defined by this failure." Her words were desperate, but there was something vulnerable in them, too. Passengers turned their heads, curious how Malcolm would respond. He regarded her for a long moment, then said softly, "Careers should not end for a single mistake, but they should change because of it. If you are sincere, then use this as the moment that defines not your failure, but your growth. But growth requires humility and accountability, not just regret." Samantha's eyes glistened. She nodded, her voice breaking. "I understand." Carolyn lowered her head. "So do I." The passengers felt the shift again. The storm was no longer just humiliation. It was transformation, painful and raw, but undeniable. Malcolm leaned back into his seat, finally allowing himself to exhale. The tide had turned, not because of wealth alone, but because truth had pierced through silence, and silence had given way to reflection. Yet he knew this was just the beginning. Outside the aircraft, the industry was already in motion. Phones were ringing in corporate offices. Board members were convening emergency calls. Investors were watching stock tickers twitch nervously. By the time the plane touched down, the future of the airline and perhaps the industry itself would already be reshaping. Inside, passengers whispered, some apologetic, some awestruck. Tyrell's phone battery blinked at 10%, but he grinned as he whispered into the mic, "Y'all, this story is bigger than any of us thought. We're watching change happen live, and I promise you, when this man lands, the whole world is gonna listen." At 10:34 m, 40 minutes past the scheduled departure, the aircraft finally began to push back from the gate. The engines rumbled, vibrations running beneath the passengers' feet, but the usual cheer of imminent travel was absent. Instead, the cabin remained tense, every soul acutely aware that they were part of a story already far larger than themselves. Captain Andrew Foster returned to the cockpit. His headset pressed tight against his ear, he had received firm instructions from the airline's operations center: maintain professionalism, avoid escalation, and prepare for corporate intervention upon landing. His hands gripped the controls, but his thoughts lingered on Malcolm Gray in seat 2A, the man whose calm presence had dismantled authority in minutes. In the cabin, Malcolm sat quietly, his posture composed, his face unreadable. The leather seat he had fought for felt no softer than before. His victory was hollow in ways most could not see. Yes, he had proven his right to sit there. Yes, he had exposed the prejudice of those who doubted him. But beneath the surface, a deeper ache pressed against his chest. Why must dignity be proven with contracts and shareholder stakes? Why must humanity be validated by power instead of respected by default? He closed his eyes briefly, breathing deeply, steadying his thoughts. Across the aisle, the businessman in 1A shifted awkwardly, finally leaning toward Malcolm. "Look, I know it's not my place, but I just want to say I admire how you handled that. Most people would have lost it." Malcolm opened his eyes, meeting the man's gaze. His voice was calm but firm. Grace should not be the price of fairness. We should not have to perform composure to be treated as human. The man nodded, chastened, sinking back into his seat. Farther back, the older woman in 3C whispered to the young student beside her, "I've lived through so many decades, and yet I see we still haven't learned." Her voice cracked, heavy with the weight of history. Samantha Price moved slowly through the aisle, her service tray trembling in her hands. She offered drinks to passengers with robotic precision, her usual smile absent. When she reached Malcolm's row, she hesitated, her throat tightening. "Mr. Gray, would you like anything to drink?" He studied her face. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something rawer shame, fear, a fragile attempt at humility. His voice was even. "Water will do." She poured carefully, handing the glass with both hands as if it were a fragile offering. "Thank you," he said simply, his tone giving nothing more, nothing less. She nodded quickly and moved on, her shoulders hunched. Near the back, Tyrell Johnson whispered into his phone. His live stream had ended when his battery died, but now he recorded clips for later upload. His eyes still shone with adrenaline. "This man changed everything today," he whispered. "Not just for himself, for everybody watching." He leaned back, thinking of his younger cousins, of friends who had shared their own stories of humiliation at airports and ticket counters. This wasn't just content for him. It was proof, living proof, that calm resistance and truth could rewrite the narrative. Half an hour into the flight, the seatbelt sign dimmed. Conversation sparked quietly across the cabin, passengers still digesting what had unfolded. Some whispered apologies to each other for not speaking up sooner. Others avoided eye contact, unwilling to confront their silence. Caroline Evans sat rigid in her jump seat, her clipboard tucked away now, her career flashing before her eyes. She thought of her pending promotion, of the glowing evaluations she had collected over the years, all of it now jeopardized by one decision made in haste, rooted not in procedure, but in prejudice. Her throat burned. For the first time in years, She questioned not her competence, but her character. Malcolm, meanwhile, reached into his briefcase once more. This time he pulled out a slim leather notebook. He opened it to a page filled with notes and reflections, his handwriting neat and deliberate. He jotted a few lines, not for the airline, not for the public, but for himself. Dignity denied, proof demanded, power revealed, change must follow. The words steadied him. He had always believed in preparation over reaction, in building systems that could withstand injustice rather than relying on emotional outbursts. Yet the pain of the incident still lingered, raw and undeniable. A soft knock on his shoulder pulled him from his thoughts. It was Officer Grant. The older man leaned slightly into the aisle, his voice low. "Mr. Gray, I wanted to say this before we land. I'm sorry. I've seen a lot in my years. But this one's going to stick with me. You handled it better than most men could." Malcolm met his eyes, recognizing the sincerity there. "Thank you, officer. But I hope it sticks not as a story of my composure, but as a reminder of what happens when we fail to check our bias." Grant nodded slowly. "It will, at least for me." Blake, his younger partner, shifted uncomfortably in the seat beside him, eyes downcast. He had been eager to act earlier, quick to treat Malcolm as a threat. Now the shame weighed on him like a lead vest. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. Instead, he sat in silence, the lesson burning into him. 2 hours into the flight, Captain Foster's voice crackled over the intercom. His usual clipped professionalism carried a different timbre now, heavier, humbler. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. I want to apologize personally for the delay earlier today. Circumstances required resolution. And while we are now safely en route to San Francisco, I acknowledge that what occurred was not acceptable. Our airline takes these matters seriously, and actions will follow to ensure such incidents do not repeat. Thank you for your patience." The announcement drew murmurs across the cabin. Some passengers nodded approvingly. Others exchanged skeptical looks. Words were easy. Actions were harder. Malcolm closed his notebook, sliding it back into his briefcase. His expression remained calm, but his heart was heavy. He knew the airline would scramble to protect itself, to minimize damage, to spin the narrative, but he also knew he held the leverage to demand more. This was not over, not by a long shot. As the aircraft soared westward, the world below churned with noise. News anchors debated the incident. Analysts speculated about stock impacts. Civil rights advocates prepared statements. Politicians tweeted their outrage, while industry experts called it a wake-up call. And in seat 2A, Malcolm Gray sat quietly, looking out the small oval window at the endless sky. His reflection stared back at him in the glass, calm yet unyielding. He whispered to himself, barely audible, "This is bigger than me." The hum of the engines filled the silence that followed. Passengers glanced at him, some with admiration, some with unease, but none could deny they had witnessed something unforgettable. By the time the aircraft began its descent toward San Francisco, the tide had shifted completely. The humiliation that had begun with one flight attendant's prejudice had grown into a movement, fueled by truth, carried by technology, amplified by courage. Malcolm fastened his seatbelt, his mind already calculating the conversations that awaited him upon landing. Executives, board members, journalists, they would all want answers, statements, direction. But his thoughts strayed back to his daughter again. One day, she'll read about this. And I hope she'll see not just a man who defended his seat, but a man who fought for something larger, for her. for those who come after. The descent grew bumpier, the cabin lights brightening as flight attendants moved through final checks. Samantha avoided Malcolm's eyes as she secured the galley, her shame still heavy. Caroline's clipboard remained untouched, her career uncertain. Grant leaned back, thoughtful, while Blake sat rigid, silent, and Malcolm Gray sat in 2A, a man who had endured humiliation, revealed power, and demanded change. The resolution in the air was not the end. It was the prelude to what came next. The aircraft descended through the low clouds over San Francisco Bay, sunlight glinting off the water below. Passengers sat upright, the seatbelt sign glowing above their heads. But nobody's mind was on the landing. Every soul in that cabin knew they were part of something bigger than a flight. They were witnesses to a reckoning, a story already racing ahead of them at the speed of the internet. Malcolm Gray sat calmly in 2A, his hands folded in his lap. He had not spoken much since the captain's apology. He had chosen silence now, letting the hum of the engines and the weight of what had transpired settle over him. But his silence was not surrender. It was preparation. He knew the moment they touched down, the next battle would begin. Samantha Price moved through the aisle one final time, checking seatbelts and tray tables. She kept her eyes down, her once sharp tone replaced by quiet murmurs. Each glance toward Malcolm sent a ripple of shame through her chest. She had stripped a man of dignity, and though he had accepted her apology, she knew his forgiveness was not absolution. She wondered if she would ever forgive herself. Caroline Evans sat stiffly in her jump seat near the front, clipboard tucked away, her eyes fixed on nothing. She had spent her career demanding order, efficiency, obedience, but order built on prejudice had crumbled today, and now she faced the fallout. Would her name be attached forever to this scandal? Would her decades of service matter less than one failure? Officer Grant leaned back, his weary eyes on Malcolm. In all his years, he had never seen someone hold power so calmly, never seen prejudice turned so completely on its head. His partner, Officer Blake, sat rigid beside him, silent, his face pale with the weight of shame. The businessman in 1A closed his laptop. Finally too restless to work, he glanced at Malcolm, respect etched across his features. The older woman in 3C clutched her hands tightly, whispering what sounded like a prayer. Tyrell Johnson, in the middle rows, tapped his dead phone, already imagining how he would upload the clips later. He knew he had recorded history, and the world would soon know it too. The wheels screeched against the tarmac, the cabin jolting as the aircraft touched down. A ripple of relief passed through the passengers, but it was quickly replaced by anticipation. What waited at the gate was not baggage claim and hotel shuttles. What waited was accountability. As the plane taxied to its gate, Captain Andrew Foster's voice filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to San Francisco. Local time is 12:46 p.m. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until we reach the gate. I want to thank you again for your patience, and on behalf of our crew, I acknowledge today has been difficult. We will address this matter further with our leadership team. Thank you." His voice cracked slightly on the word acknowledge. The cabin noticed. The aircraft rolled to a stop. The seatbelt sign blinked off, but no one moved. Eyes turned toward 2A, toward Malcolm, waiting. Malcolm rose slowly, adjusting his jacket, retrieving his briefcase from beneath the seat. His movements were deliberate, calm, almost ritualistic. He stepped into the aisle, every passenger's gaze following him. At the front of the cabin, 3 airline executives waited. Their crisp suits and tight smiles contrasted sharply with the tension that still lingered. Behind them stood two additional security officers, not with hostility, but with caution. Cameras flashed from the jet bridge where journalists had already gathered, tipped off by the viral storm. One executive, a tall man with graying hair, stepped forward. His voice was polished, rehearsed. "Mr. Gray, I am Richard Lang, Vice President of Customer Relations. On behalf of the airline, I extend our deepest apologies. We understand the gravity of this incident, and we are prepared to address it at the highest level." Malcolm's gaze was steady. "Apologies have been offered. Accountability is what matters now." Passengers leaned forward in their seats, listening. Even those who had been silent throughout the flight now sensed the weight of history pressing in. Lang nodded stiffly. "Our board is convening an emergency meeting this afternoon. We would like you to join us to discuss immediate reforms." Malcolm's lips pressed into a thin line. "I will attend, but understand this reform cannot be cosmetic. It cannot be a public statement and a diversity poster. It must be structural, transparent, binding." Cameras flashed again. Executives shifted nervously. Tyrell, standing in the aisle now, whispered to himself, "He's taking this fight all the way." The businessman in 1A spoke up suddenly, his voice carrying, "I'll testify if needed. I saw everything. This man was humiliated for no reason." The older woman in 3C added, her voice trembling but resolute, "Me too. It was wrong, and we all saw it." Other passengers murmured their agreement. For the first time, the silence that had once allowed the humiliation to fester broke into something stronger. Solidarity. Malcolm acknowledged them with a small nod. "Thank you. It should not have taken so long, but thank you." Samantha stepped forward then, her face pale, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mr. Gray, I know my apology may mean little, but I will prove through action that I can be better. If I am given the chance, I will not waste it." Caroline followed, her clipboard clutched tight. "Mr. Gray, I failed in leadership. I see that now. Whatever consequences come, I accept them." Malcolm's eyes moved between them. His tone softened slightly, though it remained firm. Accountability is not about ending careers. It is about ensuring growth and preventing repetition. If you are sincere, then let this moment define your change. Samantha's eyes filled with tears. Caroline bowed her head. Executives glanced at one another, calculating the weight of his words. They knew every syllable was being recorded, broadcast, dissected. They knew their future as a company hung in the balance of this man's calm insistence on dignity. Malcolm stepped forward, his voice steady, clear. Today was not just about me. It was about a system that allows assumptions to override truth. That system must change. And if my presence here forces that change, then let it be so. But know this, if you fail, the world is watching, and I will not hesitate to hold you accountable again. The cabin erupted into applause. It began softly, with the woman in 3C, then spread quickly through the rows until the sound filled the aircraft. Passengers clapped not just for Malcolm, but for the truth spoken, for the dignity reclaimed, for the hope that change might finally follow humiliation. Malcolm gave a faint nod, his expression calm but resolute. He turned toward the jet bridge, stepping into the blinding flash of cameras, executives trailing behind him. Tyrell whispered to his phone as he recorded the moment. "Remember this man's name? Malcolm Gray. He just changed the game." The door closed behind them, but the legacy of what had happened inside that cabin would not. It would ripple outward through boardrooms, newsrooms, and households, sparking conversations, policy changes, and perhaps a little more courage in the next passenger who dared to claim their rightful seat. As the plane touched down, the applause that filled the cabin was more than relief. It was recognition of a man who stood tall in the face of humiliation, who answered prejudice with calm strength, who turned a moment of injustice into a blueprint for change. Malcolm Gray didn't just defend his seat, he defended dignity itself. He reminded us that respect should not depend on appearances, wealth, or power, that dignity is inherent, not earned. His story forces us to ask, how often do we stay silent in the face of wrong? And what would happen if we, like Malcolm, chose to confront it with truth and resolve? This story is not only a call to remember the pain of discrimination, but also to embrace the possibility of transformation. From passengers who admitted their silence to an airline forced to confront its bias. This was more than an incident. It was a turning point. And it leaves us with a challenge. Will we be bystanders next time? Or will we speak up? If this story touched you, share it. If you believe in dignity for all, like this video. And if you want to hear more powerful stories of justice, resilience, and change, make sure to subscribe to our channel, because the next story may be one the world needs to hear.